the Reverend Joan Brown Campbell up to say a few words.
I would be glad to. Thank you. Thank you so much. There is nothing like being last. What marvelous stories. I spent quite a bit of time going back and forth with the people that love me about what story should I tell. And I finally decided that the story that I wanted to share today is the story of Elian Gonzalez. I like the oh yeses. It tells me you know the name. This is a little boy, now 24 years old. He was 5 years old when I got to know him, and I got to know him in the most difficult way. If you remember the story of Elian Gonzalez, little Cuban boy, whose mother had put him on a raft to take him along with the man that she loved, who in fact ended up being not so lovable at the long run. He lived, the rest of the people died. And the fact of the matter is, this little boy was 3 days and more all by himself on a raft. And when he was found, they brought him back into Cuba. And in the lack of wisdom of this country's way of looking at that, it immediately makes him an issue because he's a Cuban little boy. They put him in a hospital. He called up his father, and there was an uncle that lived there. Now that would seem like a good idea, right? This is family. And so they move him to the uncle's house, and in the process, the uncle decides that he should be an American, he should stay an American, and he would do everything he could to keep him from going back to Cuba. The phone rang in my office. I was then the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. We had a 75-year record of relationship to Cuba, and especially to the Cuban Council of Churches. The phone rang. It was the head of the Council of Churches in Cuba, and he said, we have Fidel Castro on the line. He'd like to speak to you. This was not my normal phone call, and so I treated him in the honorly way, and he said, we have a little boy that has been essentially imprisoned by his uncle, and we want you to get into this. We think it would be helpful if, as head of this large church agency, you would call President Clinton and tell him that I would like to speak with him. I'm thinking he could have called him himself, but never mind. You don't say to Fidel Castro, why don't you call him? And so I said, all right, we have a long history with Cuba. And so I said, Mr. President, I would like to come to Cuba and to meet with the family. I'm watching this clock. It goes click, click, click. And this is a long story, so I have to watch it carefully. But what really happened was when I went to Cuba, and I'll never forget what I had to do. They wanted me to meet with the family. A Cuban family, if we have any Cubans in the audience, know. If that's my family, it's 10 people, maybe, at the most. For them, it was 45, because we had every aunt, every uncle, and thankfully they said, we understand that you, through the National Council of Churches, might be able to help us to get our little boy back. But we don't want to just do that. We want to know you, and we need to ask you. So essentially it was like, we heard the offer, and we went through a wonderful, wonderful period of time while little babies got fed, and finally they said, we've decided you can do this. And they gave me a beautiful bouquet of flowers and sent me off on the most difficult job I've ever had in my entire life. And I realized there was not much was going to get that little boy out of the hands of this man and out of the Cubans there in their own place. And so I thought, all right, the only way we're going to get him back, and if the American people see the family that I saw, they are going to know that this little boy has a home in Cuba with parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And so I thought, all right, I'm going back to Cuba and I'm going to ask the president who could come with me of the family. And he looked at me and he said, the grandmothers. I thought, oh my God, this is not who I would have picked. I mean, but being a grandma, I said, okay, they've never been out of Cuba. They have never been in an airplane. And they agree they'll come. This clock is ticking, so I have to move this story fast. It's such a wonderful, wonderful story. And so they get on the plane. They arrive. There are 200 people, all from the press, waiting to ask them about their grandson. And what were they there for? Were they afraid? Had they ever been out of Cuba before? No. They sat there, determined grandmothers that they were, and said, we love him. We're going to get him back. And so they came, and they came to my house to stay. And just to ease up the story for a minute, I, who am very poor in my language, but the next morning we get up, there's one thing I know how to do, make food. We'll give them breakfast, we'll give them coffee. And they were great on the food. But we got to the coffee and they went, this is not Cuban coffee. And so in the week that they stayed with me, I learned to make Cuban coffee, and they found us a little shop down the street that made Cuban coffee, and we did better with our coffee. They saw 77 members of the United States Congress, and they changed the minds of the people in Congress. And in the main, for every congressperson, they said, we have got to get this little boy home. It was, in fact, almost a year before we were able to get the little boy in the hands of the people that loved him. It was the most dangerous thing that I have ever done. I had to have the FBI outside the door of my home for the entire time that we were working on this issue. My neighbors were not too thrilled with this idea, but the fact of the matter is I got educated on just how difficult were these relationships. And I also got very, very much to know how hard it was going to be. The little boy was in Cuba. He was in the United States. He was essentially held prisoner in his uncle's house, and he was not able to get out. And I'll never forget the night that his father called me and he said, I'm going to get him. He had a wife and a new baby, and she said, you're not going unless I go with you. We picked up, went to Florida. The grandmothers got to see the little boy, but it was still a period of time before we were able to get him out of this to go back home to his people. The fact of the matter is, the story of this is really a story of courage. The grandmothers came, they met the people in Congress, they made known who they were, but it wasn't enough. Finally, I went back and I said, all right, the only person that's going to do this is his father. And so we convinced his father and we convinced Fidel Castro that he should come. So then we meet the morning that he's going to get on the plane to go and get his son back. Fidel gives a speech about what he has to say, and it's a speech about what does Cuba believe in. And I listened to this, and I said very patiently, El Jefe, this is not what he needs to say. And the people sitting around Castro said, she doesn't understand. You don't talk to him that way. That's Fidel Castro. You don't tell him he doesn't know what he's doing. And he said to me, well, what would he say? I said, he says one thing. This is my son. I love him. He has an entire family in Cuba that adore him. I just want to bring him home. And Fidel Castro looked at me and he said, Magnifico. Magnifico. He said, this is what we needed to hear. And so we put him on the plane. He came to the United States, and the story you know. It took another 6 months before we were able to get him back to Cuba. But when the United States, in their wisdom, began to say, and people began more and more to understand this story as they met the family, it's very American to say it's his own family. That's all that they want, is to have their little boy returned. And so after a long struggle, the court finally met, the Supreme Court, and they said, we will rule that he needs to go home. And that ended all of the court battles that were going on to keep him there. And so the day came. In order for him to be safe, we had to have over our heads safety so that he wouldn't be shot on the way to the plane. It continued to be extremely dangerous. He got on the plane with his father, and when he got there, the only people that met him at the airport, by the decision of Fidel Castro, not a single member of the government, it was his parents, his grandparents, and people who loved him. Elian Gonzalez is now 24 years old. I have been to see him every year. I've never lost track of him or his family. He's now a graduate of college, and he is scheduled now to come to Canada. It'll be one of his first trips outside of the fact. Yes, Yay Canada is right. We wanted him here, but it didn't quite work. The election got in the way, I'm sorry to say. But the purpose of the story is the courage of American people. When they saw a little boy, when they met the family, and when they began to see he had a wonderful family and he needed to go home to that family. And never have I been more proud of our country than when I watched the people pour out and say, of course, he needs to be home with his family. It was for me personally, of all the things I've done in my 85 years, this was the toughest of all. And I took the most satisfaction out of the fact that he was able to walk into the arms of his family. No one was there. Fidel Castro didn't go to the plane. He felt it was inappropriate. What was appropriate was that that little boy was received into the arms of his parents and his grandparents. The one grandmother only lived very shortly time. Remember, she's the one that also lost her daughter. And she lived only a short time after he came home. The other grandmother is there. The great-grandmother is now gone. And she was one of the most moving, I think, of all of them. And I happened to have a beautiful pin on the day that we were talking to the family. And she took a look at that and she said, oh, that's beautiful. And it was a cross. And so I gave it to her. Yes, right. She took it off and hung it over the picture of Fidel Castro. But the end of the story is not finished, of course. We'll see what happens to Elian Gonzalez and to his family. But for the American people, it was a moment of pride. I kept saying, just let people see the family and let them understand that a wonderful family awaits this child's return home. And all of the criteria said that 85% of the American people were then in favor of his going home. And the fact remains that our own understanding of family and of courage and of where this child belonged overrode the hatred that was present. The people, for all kinds of reasons, wanted him to stay where he was. And so, as dangerous as it was, and I don't have time to tell you, but I don't think that ever has my own family been in as much danger as the simple fact of trying to get this little boy home. But of course, what is the story about? It's about courage, it's about a family, it's about a child that is now growing up to be a wonderful young man with the family that wanted him home all the way through. And so I think it tells the story that many of us want to know, not just of that story, but of what it means for people to line up and say, this is really something we can understand and we want to support this. It was a tough story, it was a tough ride, but it was the kind of victory that made you say, after all, we are a good people. We are God's people. And this little boy is now in the right place where he belongs. Thank you.
Responses, thoughts. Very common story and kind of an inside, behind the scenes look at a story we all know, or at least thought we knew.
Yeah, thank you.
And I couldn't help, as we were talking about, listening to you talking about a young boy and the country's compassion that came forward for his family, and I couldn't help but reflect on the number of young Black women and men who have been killed by police or by so-called, what are they called? Neighborhood watch. Yes. And how hard it has been for us to hear compassion from from people of this country for those young men and women and for their families, and that rather, and I think that the question is not so much to you, but to this gathering, is how do we decide who is deserving of compassion?
That's it. Yes.
Because, you know, I was struck by the man who was pulled off he's from Kentucky, right?
Yeah.
Who was pulled off the United plane, and that the next day was published the fact that he'd had his license suspended. And I was like, oh, he must have been Black, because I hadn't seen the video then, right? So like, oh, he must have been Black, because that's who dirt comes out of instead of compassion.
Right.
So yeah, and
No,
your story just brought that to me, because I remember particularly the Trayvon Martin, because my son is about that same age, and I could not fathom. So I ask.
But thank you, because this is the power of the story alone, is to say, because encountering the negativity that people had and the keeping of a child away from his own family, and I think you could not have said that better, which is, this has to help people say, where are we? Where's the courage? And I think that is, if there's anything to be said about all of what we're trying to do here, it's ultimately to say, where is the courage that stands up? Each of us have talked about a person that has said, it's all right, so it's dangerous. So you're taking a risk. But the fact of the matter is, there is courage. And one of the things that I keep wanting to talk about and to say, the advantage of my age for me is I lived through a time in which I worked with Dr. King, and I saw some courage, not just in him, but in what the courage he arose in other people. And that's what I want to say too, is where is that? How do we awaken again we need it now, perhaps like we've never needed it before.
I really appreciate your reflection and that story. I think there's this, for me, this interesting dichotomy between, and perhaps just a relationship, a symbiotic relationship between the tension around inspirational agitation that will, within our faith communities, move us to action, translate compassion to action. And also, on the flip side, a challenge, the courage to own up to our collective complicity with the structures and systems that we are all invariably a part of and beneficiaries of in one way or the other, that perpetuate the extraordinary disparities and segregation that makes it easier, some cases, to express compassion for people 10,000 miles away than it does for people right here in your backyard in Louisville or on the south side of Chicago. And, you know, there are sociologists in Chicago used to talk about this phenomena of like the Gold Coast and the slum in the early 20th century, when the disparities had to confront each other every day. You would come out of the Gold Coast and you're right there in Cabrini Green. But there's an interesting phenomena over the last 30, 40 years, certainly, as, you know, we have de-invested from urban centers, taken down projects, created more segregated spaces so that, you know, you have gated communities. Projects don't no longer have to confront you in the face every single day. And so the phenomena is out of sight, out of mind oftentimes. And then we wonder, the interesting conversation I get sometimes coming from Chicago is, what about the violence in Chicago? But I have to ask, and you mentioned Carol Anderson's great book, White Rage, that everyone should read that. The violence didn't start a couple, 3, 4 years ago. The violence started the first time a black and brown family entered into the blood-soaked, stained streets of Chicago, who they were fought. Bricks were almost thrown into every black family's house on the south side. And the violence was also about the violent disinvestment from the neighborhoods, in terms of taking out any hope. So for a young person to live in Chicago right now, you're living in schools with 50% dropout rates. You're living with, you know, we're talking about 30, 40, 50 blocks that are utterly decimated, no viable business. You're walking, one of the saddest scenes for me in and around my neighborhood is on Halloween night, when I see kids who literally have to walk blocks upon blocks upon blocks just to find a house that has a light to trick or treat on. And that's the reality in a city that just 5 miles away, people have no idea about. And so the conversation, I think, is the challenging, I think courage is an important question. The courage to challenge our own collective complicity is not just a good-bad dichotomy. It is complicated, it is messy, and I think that's my attempt to suggest that, again, the messiness is in our own localities is where we need to spend more time in thinking about finding spaces for inspiration that we can do it.
And that's where we're going to start our discussion in just a minute.
Can I say just one thing?
Yes.
I think you're so right on this, because what I was wanting to have come out of this story really was, why are we so shy on courage? And there's one of the things I learned out of what happened was, it costs a lot to be courageous. It puts people at danger. And the fact of the matter is, but it also is the sense of compassion. I mean, if Karen Armstrong were sitting here, she would say, if you do not think of compassion as a high-cost decision, then you don't understand what compassion really is about. It is not something easy.